So as you may or may not know, we have quite a selection of Warframes that multiply the amount of loot you can get from enemies. And people constantly argue about which one is better. But why? Don't they all do the same thing? Well, yes, but also no. They can all give you more loot, but they all do it differently. Let's start off with the OG, Necros and his Desecrate. This is the most passive option. It's a toggle ability that costs energy or health if you're using the Despoil augment whenever it desecrates a corpse. But what does that actually do? Well, when you toggle on Desecrate, it will randomly pick a corpse within 25 meters, which is affected by power range, and it will do two things. First, it checks whether or not the corpse drops a health orb. This is a 60% success rate, and it's why Despoil is so good. It basically makes Desecrate free, because when you turn on Desecrate, the ground will be covered in health orbs, which then also allows you to take advantage of mods such as Equilibrium to also fill up your energy, and or health conversion to get a bunch of extra armor. If this roll is successful, it then rolls again with a 90% success chance to see whether or not the enemy drops more loot. This means that whenever you desecrate a corpse, you only have about a 54% chance to get more loot. And this is unscalable, you cannot change this number. This is both good and bad. It's bad because you can't make it more effective, but also good because you can run whatever stats you want without affecting the loot multiplication. The reason why people like Desecrate, despite the success chance on the extra loot being relatively low, is because you don't have to think about it. You toggle it on, and as long as you have a bit of extra range on your Necros, you will desecrate most, if not all, corpses that hit the ground because of its so-called popcorn effect, where it takes a while to get the first corpse, but after that you will be desecrating 3 corpses per second. So the main thing about Desecrate is that it's passive and it works really well in most mission types as long as your allies aren't spread too far apart. It also stacks with all the other farming abilities because it's the only one that extracts the loot from a corpse. And finally, if you're using Necros as your farming frame of choice, you want to use a slash-based weapon when desecrating. The reason for this is that when you deal slash damage to the enemy's torso, there's a chance you will cut them in half, and if you do that, you can actually desecrate each half separately. Now, people always say that this does not work, but it absolutely does. You just need to cut the entire enemy in half, not just hack off one of their limbs. And I think that's quite enough about Necros and his Desecrate, so let's move on to Kora and her Strangledome, more specifically Pilfering Strangledome, which makes any enemy that's held by Strangledome have a 65% chance to drop additional loot when they die. The drop chance here, just like on Desecrate, is not affected by strength, so you cannot make it more effective, but you also can't compromise it by lowering your strength below 100%. Now, the way Strangledome works is you cast it and it creates a dome of chains that has a 5 meter radius and it has a 10 meter grab radius. Both of these are affected by range. It lasts for 20 seconds, which is affected by duration, and it will grab enemies when they get within the grab radius. These enemies are suspended in the air via the chains, taking a little bit of damage every second. They take increased damage from weapons and abilities, and they taunt nearby enemies into attacking them. Additionally, if Kora hits one of them with her Whip Claw, the damage from the Whip Claw will be proliferated to all enemies that are held by the Strangledome. So this is more active than Desecrate, but it also allows you to do a lot more damage, and the chance of getting extra loot is higher. But there is a bit of a catch. You can only have 2 Strangledomes up at any given time, and each Strangledome can only chain up to 26 enemies. This is usually not a big problem unless the mission you're in has super high density and you're not very good at keeping up both of them at the same time. Honestly, the biggest issue with Strangledome is that it's just very easy to kill enemies outside of the Strangledome, especially if you're playing in a squad where your party members are just killing stuff all over the place. So it suffers from your teammates being spread too far apart, even more than Desecrate. Next on the menu we have Hydroid and his Tentacle Swarm, or rather Pilfering Swarm, because this one also requires an augment. This one is actually very similar to Pilfering Strangledome, and it makes it so that any enemy that's held by Tentacle Swarm has 100% chance to drop additional loot. It's also not affected by power strength, which is fantastic because no matter what you do with your stats, it's always going to be at 100%. So what's the downside here? Well, the ability it's attached to. Tentacle Swarm spawns 20 tentacles that last for 20 seconds, which is affected by duration, that grab enemies and hold them in place whilst doing a bit of corrosive damage and stripping away their armor with corrosive procs, with the damage being affected by strength. The main issues here are the randomness of the tentacles, number 1, and the number of tentacles, number 2. So it's really good for low density missions, which are generally not great for farming. It also doesn't stack with Strangledome since it triggers when the enemies die. It does stack with Desecrate though. Now there are two camps that exist in Warframe. The first one prefers Pilfering Strangledome because it's more reliable and it can grab more enemies, and the second one prefers Pilfering Swarm because it guarantees extra loot. And they will argue until the end of times as to which one is better. My vote is on Pilfering Strangledome because while the loot isn't guaranteed, it is far more reliable. With that being said though, if you're farming on your own on the star chart, not in Steel Path, so the enemy density is fairly low, Pilfering Swarm is actually better. So it depends on what you're doing. Moving on to Ivara and her Prowl. And we're just gonna focus on the loot stealing aspect of this. So when you're prowling around as Ivara in stealth and you get within 4 meters of an enemy, which is affected by range, and you stand next to them for 2.5 seconds, which is affected by duration. The more duration you have, the faster this happens. You can steal a random item from their drop table. This one is unfortunately affected by strength, so every point of strength you go below 100 reduces the chance of stealing loot by 1%. Though interestingly enough, if you fail to steal loot from an enemy because your strength is below 100, you can actually just try again. Now this one isn't used very much because it's fairly slow, but it's still useful in some scenarios. Mainly when there is an enemy that drops like a weapon component or a special resource. So it's not something you would farm en masse. Then it can actually be pretty useful, especially since it stacks on top of everything else, so you can steal from an enemy, then kill them in a Strangledome and then desecrate them. So it's very situational, but I have actually used it before and it was pretty decent. And finally we have Atlas's Petrify with the Orgaze Augment. This augment scans any enemy you petrify and it also gives them a 25% chance to drop additional loot. It is just like Prowl affected by power strength, but you would need 400 strength to have a guaranteed chance for extra loot. The way Petrify works is it projects a 60-degree cone in front of you with 14 meters of range, which is affected by power range, and petrify them for 20 seconds, which is affected by duration. I think Petrify is criminally underrated when it comes to farming abilities because it's actually very nice. I think the reason people don't use it all that often is because it's difficult to get enough stats for it. You can't nuke duration because the enemies need to stay petrified, you need efficiency because petrify is expensive, you need range to actually petrify a decent amount of enemies, and you need a bunch of strength to bump up the extra loot chance. It does stack with everything else though, so you could petrify an enemy, steal from them, kill them in a Strangledome, and then desecrate them for maximum disrespect. The best thing about Petrify though is that it's subsumable, so you can put it onto another frame and use it there. This is usually done on Necros. You run a Despoil Desecrate setup and then you subsume Petrify over Soul Punch and you run Orgaze as well. And before we wrap it all up, we have two honorable mentions here. The first one is Chroma with his effigy, because any enemy that dies to the effigy has a 60% chance to drop additional credits, and any enemy that dies within 10 meters of the effigy also drops 100% additional credits. This makes Chroma a pretty good credit farmer. And the second one is Wukong, because one of the passives that can trigger when you die with him gives you extra loot from enemies for 60 seconds. This is a terrible way to farm stuff. So there you go, those are the differences between the different farming abilities. They're not necessarily better or worse in my eyes, they're just different. So you want to use the one that suits what you are doing the best, or you just stack a bunch of them together to get even more loot. And that is pretty much it for the video, so I thank you very much for watching. As always guys, I hope you've enjoyed the video and found it helpful, and if you have anything else you would like to add to this, feel free to leave a comment down below. Then I would also like to extend a special thank you to all the channel members. Thank you very much guys, I really appreciate your support, and if you would like to become a channel member as well, by the way, you can check out the memberships and stuff down below. And I'll see you next time. Bye bye. Now there are two camps that exist in Warframe. The first one prefers they prefer Pilf. Did you know? Did you know that they prefer Pilf? Oh my... the Pilf camp. The first gang... There are two... What was I saying? There are two camps, not gangs. There are two camps that exist in Warframe. The first one prefers Pilfering Strangledome.